Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I think for many people, this is their first regular week back. No, I don't know. Did you go on vacation last week? I don't know what everybody was doing, but I know in Canada it's sort of the first back to school and back to regular routine, and of course opening up a new book. New school year, new year, no secular year. So a new book of the Torah. No, that all goes together. And it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Benji or Benjamin, I see officially Samuels. Really, we met each other first in Boston 25 years ago, I believe, right? When Rabbi J.J. Schechter was at the Soloveitchik Institute and in Boston, and he invited a group of rabbis to come and learn with him for a few days. That we first met. And Rabbi Samuels has been in Newton since 1995, really one of the leaders in the Jewish world, the Orthodox world, the modern Orthodox world. So it's a pleasure to have him. He is a graduate of Yeshiva University, also with a PhD from Boston University in Science, Philosophy, and Religion, and MA in Biblical Studies and Medieval Jewish History. And like I say, it's really one of the leaders of the Jewish community. And it's a pleasure, Rabbi, to welcome you back to Torah Motion. Vakasha.
Thank you so much, Rob J. And I appreciate you honoring me with a indulgent introduction, calling me a leader. But Jay, it's to you that we turn our eyes and thank you for really transitioning the Jewish community into the virtual age of online Jewish education. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to study the Torah with all of these fine people. So I'm looking at the screen. I am blessed with screens. I have three screens in front of me. The text will be in my center screen. All of your beautiful faces and or names are to the screen to my left. So if you see me turning to the left, I'm not watching Netflix. I'm not talking to another person. I am looking at your faces. The best way to either answer a question or ask a question or share a comment is to go to the bottom taskbar where you see a heart and the word reaction. If you click on that, you'll see a your hand button. When you raise your hand, you jump to the start of the line. So I'll be able to see that you want to say something. If for whatever reason that's too difficult, wave like this. My peripheral vision is still pretty good, so I'll see you in the corner. But that only works for people who have their cameras on. Everyone else, you'll listen to. We did upload the texts, so if you are using your own text, or if you'd like to, Rob J just posted them. If you want to download them, please do. I will share the screen as the general approach, and occasionally shut off the screen. So, good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you, Likrat Shabbat Parshat Shemot. And we're going to choose a topic, of course, having to do with the Parsha. And I wanted to talk about Moshe's early years. But in truth, I really want to ask a more meta question. And that is the question reduced to its binary form: are leaders made or are leaders born? And our test case, of course, will be the case of Moshe. Moshe, who is the singular leader of the people of Israel, the Redeemer and lawgiver. Moshe, who we call Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe ad Moshe, even on the Matzeva, the tombstone of Moses Maimonides, it says from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. But the original Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, sets the bar. He is our teacher. Was he made or was he born? So we have to set the scene and chronicle the early years of Moshe to answer this question. Why does he merit to become the Redeemer of Israel? Why did God choose him? Why does he answer the call? And we'll attempt to chronicle what I call the early years of Moshe, from the time of his birth to the theophany at the burning bush when God entrusts him with his sacred mission. And we'll read the text and sort out the clues, revealing the development of Moshe's personality, what forces molded his character, his education, and his experiences. And this will perhaps help us better decide whether Moshe was a born leader or evolved into a leader, whether by chance or self-assertion or divine design, and perhaps even point us to the larger question of whether leaders are born or whether they are made. So I'm going to share the screen. And every time you share the screen for the first time, it collapses the picture of all of your wonderful faces and names. So I have to once again expand that on my left screen. And you should see in front of you chapter 1 of Sefer Shemot, Exodus 8 to 22. Could I get a thumbs up if you see the text in front of you? Perfect. Excellent. Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. And there arose a new king upon Egypt who did not know Yosef. Some of you may have heard of the extraordinary early 20th century African American novelist. She was an anthropologist. She was an activist by the name of Zora Neale Hurston. If you don't know who Zora Neale Hurston, she's most famous for her work, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But she wrote a fantastic work on Sefer Shemot called Moses, Man of the Mountain. And she uses it as, of course, a parable of liberation, which was very much at the consciousness of African Americans then and perhaps even now. But she has some wonderful insights, and I'd like to quote a passage from the beginning of it. She parses Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef in this poetic rendition. Listen closely. A ruler, great in his newness and new in his greatness, had arisen in Egypt, and he had said, and listen very carefully, and the lawyers amongst you, I saw my dear, dear friend and teacher, Lawrence Coburn, on the line. I know he's an attorney. Hi, Lawrence. Listen closely. And he had said, this is law. Hebrew boys shall not be born. All offenders against this law shall suffer death by drowning. Let me say it one more time. This is the law. Hebrew boys shall not be born. All offenders against this law shall be sentenced to death by drowning. What does Zora Neale Hurston add by framing it that way? Anyone have any ideas? This is law. Hebrew boys may not be born. All offenders shall be cast into the Nile, sentenced to death. What's the brilliance of that articulation?
The brilliance is that she understands that there's going to be a conflict based on law, the Torah law versus Pharaonic law.
Wonderful, wonderful. So first of all, by framing it as law, it anticipates a contrast between the holy and ethical law that Moses brings to the people at Har Sinai ultimately, and the barbaric law of evil oppressors. Any other insights? Thank you, Gershon. Please, Sandra, I see you waving your hand. I told you my peripheral vision's pretty good. Okay. But you have to unmute, otherwise I'm not good at reading lips. I'm good at peripheral vision, but not reading lips.
Okay, how's that? Following up on the prior comment, the Nazis did that also by turning the mere existence, your mere survival, for instance, in the camps. If in fact you survived a certain amount of months in a death camp on an impossible diet, you had to have been stealing, they said, and so by law you were committing whatever they called it, a capital crime. And so in essence, that's really taking out of the playbook of Pharaoh here, because by merely existing, if you were either a male Israelite being born, or the mother who's giving birth to the male Israelite, or of course aiding him in being born, staying born, then you were committing a capital crime. So essentially, you were killing yourselves. And it's seditious and horrible, but that's what it is.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right on. You added another layer of meaning to what Gershon said before, Sandra, and you're saying that in the persecution state, right?
Yes.
It is enacted as law to do evil. And
Exactly right. That's
and
right.
we saw that at the Nazis.
Yep.
And it creates a new order, right? Vayakom melech hadash. It creates a new order that pits Egyptian society against the Israelites, and in particular against Israelite boys, but it dresses it up in law as if, it's not Egypt who's doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Israelites who are doing something wrong.
Correct. Yep.
And we see that trajectory. I'm now going to switch to the English. We'll go back to the Hebrew when we do close readings. And Pharaoh said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are becoming too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise up from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor and built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform ruthlessly. They made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. And then the king of Egypt spoke to and here I want to go back to the Hebrew. Some of you may know this already. It's one of my favorite ambiguities that is native to the Hebrew language in the construct state. The Hebrew is that Pharaoh, Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, said, La mialdot ha'ivriot. So how do we translate that phrase? Mialdot ha'ivriot. There's at least two ways to translate it. One way is the Hebrew midwives. The other way is the midwives of the Hebrews. What's the difference? Someone want to say the difference between those two articulations?
One is Hebrew midwives are Hebrews. The other is the midwives could be Egyptian or anything else.
Great. So when we look at the heroes who birthed the redemption of the Jewish people in the first chapters of Sefer Shemot, we want to know, was this led solely within the Jewish people, for the Jewish people? I'm using the Jewish people, of course, anachronistically. The Hebrews are the Israelites, the Bnei Israel. Or were there people of moral conscience other than beyond the Hebrews who stood up against Pharaoh's immoral order?
It depends whether you follow the Septuagint and Philo or the Midrash.
Wonderful. Gershon, tell us more.
Well, the Septuagint and Philo and Josephus also, they claim that the midwives were in fact Egyptians, shiksas, whereas the Midrash gives them the highest genealogical credit for being Miriam and God knows.
Yocheved and Miriam,
Yeah.
100%. 100%. And, the beautiful thing about ambiguities is they undergird the idea that Shivim Panim La Torah, that both senses are true in a certain way. We don't have to stake a claim, one or the other. There are people of conscience who stand up on behalf of the good and the right and have stood up, Chasidei Umot Olam, to protect Jews during times of persecutions. And of course, there are heroes among the Jewish people who rise up to become our defenders. And so what did the king say to them, right? So we all know the story, so you'll forgive me for just rehearsing it. But he says, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. And the midwives, fearing God, did not do so as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives, and he said to them, why have you done this, letting the boys live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come, they have given birth. And God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives fear God, he established households for them. Then, then Pharaoh turns a surreptitious conspiracy into a persecutorial state. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. This is even in some ways more egregious because it doesn't even say every Egyptian has to be an informant. It says that every Egyptian has amnesty, carte blanche, to enact this immoral order with their own hands. On the one hand, I'd like to say I can't even imagine this, but on the other hand, unfortunately, we can imagine this. We have seen this. And as Sandra said before, this was not an unusual story during the time of the Shoah. There were people who informed upon other Germans or other Germans collaborators, but upon the Hasidei Umos Haolam that hid Jews. Clearly, Anne Frank, to use a famous example, her family was told upon and arrested after so long in hiding, and there were people of conscience. So, but that's what a persecutorial state does: pits the entire nation against the people. Okay, so this is the scene. Paro and his new order pitted Egyptian against Israelite, right? And this may have consolidated the new nation, but it also brought national development to a standstill. Jews were slaves. The Israelites, in their national consciousness, focused solely on ways to silence women in labor and hide newborn sons. And so the first national challenge is mass oppression. And it's in that setting of the scene that we begin Perek Bet, chapter 2 of Sefer Shemot. Okay. Now, before we delve into the text, I want us to think more abstractly. Let me stop the share for a second. I want us to think of developmental stages, the life course, so to speak. We know Ben Azai in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot, details the life course. Ben Shlosha Asrei le mitzvah, 13 to mitzvah, 40 to binah, 80 to special strength. You know what I'm talking about if you recognize that Mishnah. And, charting out the life course is something that poets like Shakespeare, All the World's a Stage, and the Mishnah and others have done. Certainly developmental psychologists do it too. So let's just try to abstractly think about the formative period of a human being and what stages would we identify in broad strokes. We don't have to get that, microscopic. But in broad strokes, what stages would we identify in the development of a human being? Anyone want to suggest some? Any children psychologists on the Zoom? You don't have to be a psychologist to answer that question. Any parents on the Zoom? Sandra again, please.
Okay, let's try. I mean, there are the obvious ones, but let's try pre-verbal, verbal, pre walking, walking. And when you have the pre-verbal and verbal, you've got the you've got the consciousness and then the deeper levels of consciousness, and that's the child. The child, his inside, and his relationship to the outside world. I mean, boy, have we got libraries full of books about that. So that's the childness of it. It really, I guess if I were going to be more abstract, I'd say verbal and pre-verbal and verbal. preconscious and conscious.
I think that's fantastic. You are so much more sophisticated than me. But
Oh,
I
there's
love
that
that.
old picture. There's the
Yeah.
old picture of showing a crawling infant, then then a Cro-Magnon man, and then someone taller than that standing upright.
Okay.
There's all that, but then I just thought we'd go a little bit more abstract.
No, I love it. I love it. And I want you to hold that schema and categorization in your
I,
mind.
I think it's important because he tells God at the sneh, he says, Lo ish dvarim anochi. And so if we're going to categorize him as pre-verbal and what he absorbs at his mother's breast and all of that. And so if we're doing pre-verbal and then verbal, boy, we've got a lot to no pun intended, talk about because one of his hallmarks was Lo ish dvarim anochi.
100%, and I think that's spot on. And I'm not denying that this is your Chidushei Torah, but I hear reverberations of Viva Zorenberg and her brilliance in exposition and in your categorization. I was thinking much more simplistically, but I'm very grateful for your answer. I was thinking about infancy and toddlerhood and early childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and post young adulthood after adulthood, we'll call it that. So but I love your schematization. Okay. So if we use either Sandra's excellent and psychologically insightful schema, or whether we use my more simplistic one, what I want us to do is now read the Torah's narration of Moshe's early childhood, identify each of those stages, and ask the question of the text, its pshat, and perhaps its midrashic interpretation, both as interrogated and explicated by the Meforshim, and ask, are leaders made or born? It was Moses made or born. So let's start with the first pasuk, which is a very curious pasuk. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vaykachet bat Levi. And there was a man of the house of Levi who went and took a daughter of Levi, Batari Shabbatele ben, and she conceived and she bore a son in the setting that we established in chapter 1. Now, what do you make of, and there was a certain man from the house of Levi who went and took a wife, a daughter of the house of Levi? Why not give a genealogy? Now, on the one hand, it does locate it in a certain tribe, so there is some precision. But on the other hand, it is only much later toward, in the book of Exodus that we'll get a familial genealogy to Moshe. Here it begins in relative obscurity, if not anonymity. So why is that? Why does it begin that way? Some of you may be familiar with the literary term everyman. Everyman was based on these passion plays that took place in medieval and early modern Europe, usually around the time of a Christian holiday. And the idea was that there would be a person called Everyman who would have to encounter trials and temptations in life and hopefully overcome them, avoiding vices and developing moral character. And the drama represented the experience of what is known in English literature as everyman. We could gender neutralize it, call it every person. But the idea is, as you're watching this play, you would identify with the drama and say, that is my story. And everyone says, that's my story. So I raised the question of whether Vaylech ish mi beit Levi, Vaykachet bat Levi, begins in almost an everyman frame, that the story I'm going to tell you really was not the story of one particular family, but the story of every household where people under oppression, facing near despair, chose to affirm life, to marry, and to bear children, even though it was quite possible, right, that they would be informed upon, if not seized, by their neighbors and their Hebrew boys murdered. So that's one suggestion, right? That this really was every household. Vatarisha vateled ben vatere oto, and when she saw him, ki tovu, that he was goodly, v'tisbeneu shlosha yerachim. Then the mother hid the child for 3 months. Okay, let's say it again. She conceived, she bore a son, and when she saw that the baby was beautiful, that the baby was good, she hid the child for 3 months. Now, what is the challenge that we face in that verse?
Well, it's interesting that Beit Levi, I'd never thought of that, but Levi was a son whom Jacob disinherited when he said Shimon Levi Achim. He didn't like the way that Levi behaved in Shechem.
Shimon v'Levi achayhem, right? Klei Hamas bechoroteim, something like that.
Yeah. So Moses is the last person who is fit to be leader of Israel.
Excellent. Okay, but I want to get back to the question of Chaim Bruchter, please. You have to unmute. I don't read lips. I do a lot of other things, but I don't read lips.
Thank you. The challenge is 3 months, somebody will whisper to the government.
Who ever heard of a baby less than 3 months crying?
They do cry too. Cry too.
Yeah, why 3 months? That itself is curious. But even before that, Sandra.
What really actually, I have to say, plagues me, and I wrote a book about this too, and it still plagues me, is she saw him and he was good, and then she determined that she would titzpenehu for 3 months. So I think to myself, what? If he wasn't Tov, he wasn't going to merit being floated on the Nile. Now, I'm not judging. Could be they only had, I can envision a Nile with baskets and baskets, some floating, some overturning, some making it, some not making it. But it always stuck in my heart that it says she saw him, ki tovu, and she determined vatitzpaneo, and then she determined. That's tough for me, Rabbi.
It is. It's very tough. It could be that the shot simply is that ki tovu, when she saw the baby was viable, that the baby had a chance at life.
Yeah, I know the shot. You can do that, but wow.
Right, and but you're right. But that's not the simple reading of ki tovu.
Nope.
I don't know why we should read it as a measure of viability. And by the way, there was a horrible comedy in the 1970s that I remember from a kid. I was born in 1968, so I remember this. Called Holy Moses, where it was exactly that. There's a scene where you see the baby in the basket, and then it pans out, and you see thousands of baskets that all the mothers put in the Nile. But it's a horrible movie, not worth looking up. Okay, Wendy, we didn't hear from you yet. Glad to meet you.
Let me just lower. Okay, I don't know. It's a medrash from afar. I heard this recently this week that there is a view that Moshe was born 3 months prematurely, but yet he was tov, as in the sense of complete, which is how it's used in creation. And Yocheved was able to, the mother was able to hide him for 3 months because no one was expecting the baby to be born yet. So she had
Beautiful.
3 months time.
Very, very clever reading. And logical.
Not mine.
Okay, Annie, Chaim, is your hand still up from now, or was from before?
No, it's something else related to what you said before about Ish Mibet Levi.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 things. Either what you said, that happened in many cases, not like only by Amram, but many other followed or did the same thing at the same time, or the narrative is important, not the people, not the person.
Interesting. Annie.
I wanted to say that I heard another midrash that Moses was born circumcised, that he was complete in the sense of being ready to fulfill his Jewish obligation. And another thing was that you were asking about, is a leader born or made? Well, by knowing that he's part of the tribe of Levi, we know that he comes from a line of the priesthood. And is it genetic? Is it something that was passed on to him if he only stayed 3 months with his mother? But those people were not slaves.
Beautiful, beautiful. So two things. Let me take your last point. Right? Chaim had said before, at this point in the development of the story, Levi is nothing special, if anything, or not Chaim, I'm sorry, it was Gershon. Levi is nothing special. If anything, Levi got the curse instead of the blessing by Yaakov on the deathbed. So that would be something. But you're saying, but who reads the Torah from beginning to end like a book that you read for the first time? We know Levi is going to be the priesthood and the Levitehood. So we know that this is something special. Now, you quoted the Gemara in Sota that Moshe was born circumcised, which also is something that very few, but a couple, the Midrash in different places says Abraham was born circumcised, Moshe was born circumcised, which seems to point to, right, leaders are born, right? They don't develop. They're born. They're destined for that at their birth. If you daven in a Sephardic shul this week for your Haftorah, as opposed to the rest of Ashkenazim, you'll read the first chapter of Yirmiyahu Hanavi as your Haftorah. And what does Hashem say to Yirmiyahu? Right, I chose you when you were in utero. Yes, exactly. Now, Rashi, very interestingly, let me find Rashi. Rashi, quoting the Gemara in Sota, I'm going to quote it from the Gemara in Sota, but Rashi cites it. Vatera oto, I have to share the screen. Sorry about that. I'm in source number 4. Vatera oto kitovu, chachamim omrim, the sages said, b'shasha nolad Moshe nitmale habayit kulo or, that when Moses was born, the house filled with light. Ketiv hacha, because here it is written, V'tereo toki tovu, and the mother saw that he was good. Uchtib hatam, and it was written there in the first chapter of Genesis, Vayar Elohim et haor kitov, and God saw the light, that it was good. So the Gemara here is a midrashic resonance between this verse and the opening chapters of the creation of the cosmos in the beginning of Genesis, and says that we can hyperlink the two together and say that the house filled with light, the original light of creation, right? We have a term for that. We don't usually use this term in our tradition, but we call this a nativity scene, when a child is born and there's some spectacle to say, pay attention. This is someone special being born, right? Moshe is born here as the determined, destined leader, the house filled with light. That is a case. Now, Ramban very simply says, it is a known fact that all mothers love their children, goodly or ungoodly, and all of them would hide them from harm with all their might. There is thus no need for scripture to explain that she saw he was goodly. But the unique meaning of goodliness is that she saw in him some unique quality which, in her opinion, foreshadowed that a miracle would happen to him and he would be saved. Therefore, she applied herself and thought of ways to save him. When she saw that she could hide him no longer, she thought of saving him by another device, and she made him an ark of bulrushes. Right? So now Nachmanides says that she saw in him, right, some spark of prophetic promise, and therefore she went the extra mile to save him, even though mothers would save their children no matter what. That's, built into the DNA of being a mother. But perhaps we can also expand Nachmanides' reading and say that this is a little projection on Yocheved too, and perhaps a projection of all mothers who see the promise of future, of success of against all odds in the children they bring into the world. And so she endeavored to save him. Now, I want to get back to the text and continue just a little bit further. Okay, there we go. So she couldn't hide him any longer, so she made a teva. And I'll just note as a sidebar that the word teva is not hapax legomenon. It's used elsewhere. It's not a single-use word. But the last time we saw this word was in Parshat Noach. A teva is a life-saving flotation device. It could be huge and contain 2 by 2 of every created animal, or it could be small and only have room for a little baby. But it is a life-saving flotation device. And she pitched it, she lined it with the right material so that it would float and be waterproof. Vatasem ba tayeled, and she placed the child in it. Vatasem basuf al sfat hayor. Notice that the biblical text uses the same verb twice in a row to describe placing the child in the teva and then placing the child in the river. What is the word music of that repetition come to imply? Why use the same verb twice? Why not vary your verbs? It would seem to invite the idea, perhaps, that this is intentional, planned, well thought out. But here is where we come to another ambiguity. The next verse says, "Bate tatsev achoto merachok, ledea ma yeaselo." And his, meaning the baby's sister, stationed herself from afar to know what would transpire to him. Did the mother send the daughter to chase after the floating teva with the little baby Moses in it? That's not what the Torah says. It says, "Vate tatsev achoto merachok." So here there is a very difficult ambiguity. Did the mother intend to develop a sophisticated plan and in order to ensure Moshe's survival? Or is this a type of abandonment of a child into the Nile with the hope that I rather live with the uncertainty of what transpires to my child than the certainty of an Egyptian soldier taking away my child and killing it? Do you hear the question, everyone? And, I have to tell you before, and I want to hear your thoughts on that, but I never thought of the idea of an abandonment until I read a novel, again, a long time ago, by Amy Tan. I don't know if you remember it, called The Good Luck Club.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a scene in it. I brought it. I'm not going to read it with you for time's sake, but I did bring it here. There's a scene in it where it describes how a mother was trying to escape with her twins. If you remember the book or read the movie, you remember that I'm not going to give away, spoiler alert, but a mother's trying to escape during a time of war with twins. And at a certain point, she just can't carry the babies anymore. So she writes an address of the family on a picture. She places them with the children. She puts money with each child, and she leaves the children under a tree and continues walking on with the hope that someone will find the children and have mercy upon them and ultimately, hopefully, return them to the family. And she walks away crying because to hold them will be certain death, and she rather live with the uncertainty. Now, again, you might say, well, that's an ungracious reading of Moshe's mother, and I don't mean to be ungracious. I try to live life as a gracious person. But it's not impossible. I know people who survived the Shoah because they were pushed out of a moving train by their parents on the way to the death camps. And they survived because when they hit the ground, they got up and went off running. But when the parents pushed them out, they had no idea. They just knew that they had more of a chance getting out the window than they would staying on the train. And so that's what I mean by an abandonment. That it's better to live with the uncertainty and create opportunity than live with the certainty of death.
Perhaps this echoes the way that Yaakov Avinu sent Joseph to Shechem, where he was liable to be assaulted by his brothers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a interesting parallel. Annie, and then Chaim, and then I'm going to get back.
I wanted to say that Miriam, his sister, we already know that she had some level of prophecy when she told her parents that they should remarry and not, to be able to have not, because she said, you're condemning every child to death because you're not married anymore and you're not having children, not just the boy babies, you're condemning the birth of any child. So she had that level of prophecy that we've read that convinced this man to go and take a wife, right? He took her back again. So then why I would think that Miriam would have a level of prophecy that her brother was great and that she must follow.
100%. Annie, if we read this midrashically, a little later in the text, several chapters later, it's going to say, and Miriam the Hanibiyah, Miriam the prophet, and Aaron. But it doesn't mention Moshe. So it says, where Moshe? So the midrash says that it's teaching Miriam was a prophet when it was only her and Aaron, and Moshe wasn't yet on the scene. And then it narrates what you just said. So the midrash definitely believes that Moshe is a leader born, and many midrashim, being born circumcised, the house filled with light, Miriam's prophecies, all of these support that view, except that's not pshat, meaning you don't find Miriam the prophet anywhere in this original setting, in this original telling. And Shivim Panim La Torah, there are 70 facets to the Torah. There's a pshat reading, there's a midrashic reading, there's a Kabbalistic reading, Sod, there's Pardes Remez, and the allegorical reading. But the pshat is again ambiguous. It sounds like Miriam stationed herself. Now I want to keep. I'm going to ask Chaim and Sandra. I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to beg your forgiveness. I want to move a little forward. Vateitze bachoto, and she stationed herself at a distance to know what would occur to her brother. At that moment, Vatered bat Paro l'chotz al Yaor, the daughter of Pharaoh, descended on the river, and her maidens were walking, ambling on the bank of the river Nile. And she, the daughter of Pharaoh, saw the teba amidst the reeds, and she sends Amata, her maidservant. I know the Midrash says that she became Elastigirl, and she extended her arm and pulled the teva in, which is perhaps should be read as when you think you can't, something's beyond your reach, you should try, and you'll pull it in. Perhaps it's saying like she had a moment of moral conscience. Do I defy my father? Do I take the risk? Do I extend my hand beyond my grasp? And she reaches it. That's my reading of the Midrash. But Vatishlachet Hamata, the pshat is she sends her maidservant to bring her the little basket. Vatiftach, and she opened it up. Tireta Yeled, and she saw the child. And behold, there's a child crying. And we all know that when we hear someone crying, it wells up compassion in us. We're coded that way. And she has compassion on the child. And she's a smart cookie. She realizes right away, Batomir mialdei ha'ivrim zeh, that this child is a Hebrew child. Vatomer achoto el bat paro, and then she raises up her gumption and she approaches the princess and says, shall I go call the child, a wet nurse from amongst the Hebrews, to nurse the child? And the daughter of Pharaoh says, go. And she goes and calls the mother of the child. And the daughter of Pharaoh says, Heilechi et hayeled hazeh, take with you this child and nurse it on my behalf, and I will pay you your wage. And the woman takes the child and nurses the child. Now, we don't know if the woman and the child go back to the palace and live in a protected room, whether they go into hiding, whether they have some type of official writ that protects them in the Jewish ghetto, so to speak. We don't have that insight. We only know what the text tells us. But here I want to get back to our developmental tree. Why do you think it was important that infant Moshe, excuse me 1 second. Hi, I apologize. I'm teaching on Zoom, so thank you. Hi, sorry about that. Okay. It's good. It's 9:17 and we have an active shul. Okay. Why is it important that infancy be spent with Moshe's birth mother? Any suggestions? Chaim.
Okay. Basically, it's very important because later on, when we see Vaigdal and he gets older, Vayetze, what does it suddenly, how he realizes that he is really the people who slave, they are really a part, he is a part of this nation. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. I mean,
yeah, so there's always a question in the narrative of Moshe, when does he learn that he's really an adopted Hebrew boy?
On those 3 years, until Vayigamal.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Every cinematic rendition of the Moshe story stakes out a different claim. The original 10 Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, if you remember that one. It's like Moshe's a grown man, and I forgot the starlet's name. She's like holding up a baby blanket and says, Moses, do you recognize this blanket? You're really a Hebrew. And that's when he like has this crisis of identity in his adulthood. And in Prince of Egypt by Steven Spielberg, the cartoon, right? Moshe has sung a lullaby by Miriam, Ashir Lashem Ki Gaoga, or something like that. And then when he hears the baby melody, it triggers a memory of where he comes from, right? So Chaim says, right, that it is so important during, I think there's a developmental theory called attachment theory, that when children are born, like there's that childhood book, Are You My Mother, right? The duckling wakes up and whoever it sees first, it knows is its mother, right? An infant attaches itself to the person who cares for the infant. And so deep rooted and seated in the child is an attachment to the Hebrews, whether he, here you get back to Sandra, pre-conscious and conscious, right? At a very intrinsic level, he knows he is rooted in his Jewish identity, so to speak. And then we have the pasuk that Chaim mentions, Vayigdal hayeled, and the child grew, Vativieu levat Paro, and he's brought to the daughter of Pharaoh, Vayila levein, and he becomes to her as a son. Vatikra shemo Moshe, and she calls him Moshe, Vetomer ki mina mayim mishitiu, because I drew you forth from the water. Now, Vaidal Hayeled, how old is he when he's brought back to the daughter of Pharaoh?
No idea. There is no comment about that.
No comment. The only thing we might surmise is that after he's weaned, he's no longer nursing. That's when he's brought to the daughter of Pharaoh. And how old is a child when he no longer nurses? Let's just say 2 or 3. On average, let's just say 2 or 3. Now, Ibn Ezra says something extraordinary. I don't know, and Ibn Ezra has 2 different commentaries. Actually, he wrote so many commentaries. He traveled around all over, and one of the way he kind of like paid his way for all his wonderful, gracious hosts was he would write commentaries in their memory. So this is what he says. Okay, Ibn Ezra Ha'aroch, he says, Umachshavot Hashem amku, the plans of God are deep. Umi yochal la'amod besodo, and who could figure them out? Below levad nitkanu alilot. It's a poem. Okay, I'm not going to try to parse it perfectly. Ulai sibeb Hashem zeh shigdal Moshe bebeit hamalchut liot nafsho amadrega ha'elyona b'derech halimud ba'regilut. God arranged things so that Moshe would be raised during his childhood, early childhood and adolescence in the palace. Why? So that he would have an uplifted and esteemed spirit. And not a slave mentality. And we see that because in the narrative as it follows, right, we'll ask, where does he get the courage to stand up against injustice? Where does he get the courage to take on the Egyptian taskmaster or the two Jews who are fighting? Where does that come from? Well, that comes from the Prince of Egypt, not from the Hebrew slave baby-born Moshe. So Ibn Ezra, right, already indicates that we could parse Moshe's early years. We have the attachment during his infancy and toddlerhood, and then we have his education and his raising in the royal palace during his childhood and adolescence. And we could expand that and say he was probably trained in economics and management and military warfare and strategy, and he had exposure. So if that's the case, if indeed that is the case, that he needed years of attachment to the Hebrew and he needed years of preparation and training as a prince of Egypt, are leaders made or born? That would clearly point to the idea that Moshe had to be developed. He had to be evolved. He was not only born, but he was made. Now, the very next pasuk is really interesting because it says, Vayehi bayamim hahem, and it was in those days. And that's the Tanakh's way of saying after much time passes. How much time exactly? Well, that's a debate. We'll actually talk about that. Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe grew up. Vayitzei Achav, and he goes out to his brethren. Vayar b'sivlotam, and he sees their suffering. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav, and he sees an Egyptian man smiting a Hebrew man of his brethren. Now, Rashi, like the rest of us, will note that the previous pasuk said Vayigdal hayeled, and now it says, and some time passes, Vayigdal Moshe, and Moshe grew. So what's the difference between Vayigdal hayeled and Vayigdal Moshe? It's the same verb, almost the same articulation, two verses in a row, even though there seems to be a period of time between the two verses. What's the difference? What's a Yeled and what's a Moshe? A Yeled is an unformed child. Thus, Ibn Ezra, he had to be formed in Beit Paro. What is a Moshe? Someone with an identity, with a name, with a sense of self. But even in that moment, Vaidal Moshe vayetze el Echav, he went out to his brethren. Which brethren? The Egyptians who were overseeing the building work, or the Hebrews who were building it? Is this the omniscient narrator speaking to us, saying he went out to his brethren, he just didn't realize it? Or is Moshe in the know, and he knows that, in essence, he's really a Hebrew at this moment? The most extraordinary thing to me is Vayar b'sivlotam, and he saw their suffering. It is not an easy thing to see the suffering of others if you come from a place of privilege. Some of you may remember that felicitous lyric in Simon and Garfunkel's song, "The words of the prophets are written on subway walls, tenement halls." Remember that phrase? right? What's that mean? It means you look at graffiti, one person sees vandalism, another person sees a cry for help, a cultural pride, something else. Here is the Prince of Egypt going out to survey the building works, and he sees suffering, human suffering, in a hierarchical system of haves and have-nots, of slaves and masters. Moshe sees suffering. Vayar ish mitzri, and he sees an Egyptian man as an oppressor. Makeh ish ivri me'echav. Right? Does he know he's a Hebrew and he sees them of his brethren? Does he identify with them even though he may not know? I'd like to even suggest in the next pasuk when it says Vayifen ko va-ko, when he looked this way and that way, that he's looking, am I Moshe or am I, a Hebrew boy? Am I the prince of Pharaoh, a prince of Egypt, or am I a Hebrew boy? He looks this way and that way. The pshat, of course, he wants to see anyone's around. Vayar ki ein ish, and he sees there's no person. Right? The pshat is no one's looking. He could act with impunity, and so he strikes the oppressor and he buries him in the sand. But the midrashic reading is, right, he looks this way and that way. Who am I? Vayar ki ein ish, and he sees there's no leader. There's no one to stand up against injustice. Im ein ani li mili, fine, right? If I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? But l'chshani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I'm only for myself, then who am I? B'makom she'ein ish yishtadol li'od ish. In a place where there's no person, rise up, be the person, become the leader. So we see that Moshe's early years, right, his infancy, his attachment to the Hebrew people, his childhood and adolescence is in the house of Pharaoh, where he is trained and developed, not with a slave mentality, but with courage, with boldness, with an ability to act, with perspective and thought. And he rises into leadership. He develops. He develops. And then we have 3 occasions where he stands up against injustice, if you remember. One is when he kills the taskmaster. The other is when 2 Jews are quarreling, and he says, why are you quarreling? And they say, are you going to kill us like you killed him? And then he runs away, and he comes to Midian, and he sees that the daughters of Yitro are being harassed by the other shepherds, and he rises to save them. Vayakom Moshe, right? Parallel to a new king arose, this time, and Moses arose. He rises into his fullness, into the man he's going to be. Vayoshian vayeshket sonam, and he saved the daughters of Yitro, and he gives them drink. Now, I want to show you, and I apologize, I see some hands up, but I'm also looking at the clock, and I am almost out of time. So I want to show you this very interesting question. How do we parse Moshe's life? Here's the Midrash Tanchuma. How old was Moshe, Vayigdal Moshe v'yetzei lechav, when he gets up and he goes out? So the Midrash Tanchuma says, Vaya Moshe bepaltrin shel Paro esrim shana. Moshe was in the palace of Pharaoh for 20 years. 20 years old sounds like a good amount of time when he has a spiritual and moral awakening and he goes out and he decides to rebel against the house of Pharaoh. B'yeshomrim, but there's those that say that he was in Egypt before he went his walkabouts in the building works and stood up to injustice till he was 40. Now, we have some certain numbers. How old is Moshe when he dies? 120. How long did he leave Bnei Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. Which mean at the time of, hey, Pharaoh, let my people go. No, 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 I will not let them go. How old is he? 80.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we understand his first 80 years? What I'm calling his early years. right? So we have his infancy, attachment to the Hebrews. We have his childhood and adolescence, being raised and trained and made into a leader in the house, the palace of Pharaoh. We have his moral awakening at age 20 when he goes out, maybe age 40. And then we have between 40 or 60 years between he runs away from Egypt and he comes back to confront Pharaoh and become the redeemer of the Israelites. I'm rounding up, but roughly that's the thing. So what about those 60 years? So I actually, for Torah in Motion, in a different year, I talked about Yitro and counselor and confidant and the role that Yitro played in Moshe's life. But it's clear that those 60 Odyssey years, you've heard that expression, the Odyssey years, they're usually between like age 20 and 35 today when kids go out and they try to discover who they are. It used to be much shorter of a period, but today it takes a lot longer, right? Moshe's Odyssey years are between 40 and 60 years. When he goes out, when he marries, when he has children, when he is mentored by Yitro, and ultimately in pastoral mode as a shepherd, when he chases a little shepsel and beholds a wondrous sight, and he turns aside to view it, a bush that is burning, that is not consumed, and a divine voice calling, charging him to become the leader he was born to be, or the leader he had developed into after all of these life experiences. You may remember the famous quote in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, some are born great, and some have, it's three things. Some are born great, something, and some have greatness thrust upon them, right? It's the same chakira, the same dialectic. Our leaders made or born. Was Moshe made or born? Is it both? Is it one or the other? The Torah leaves it ambiguous, and that's for a good reason, because perhaps there's a little bit of destiny and development in all of us, and we have to believe that. But Moshe certainly can be read as the born leader. This is all part of God's plan from the moment of creation. The light of creation filled the house. But there is great reason to read the text that Moshe is developed by his unique experiences into the leader he was meant to be. And for those of us who are still raising children, those of us who are grandparenting our grandchildren and still parenting our children, or those who are just reading the text, it really invites us to think about childhood development. We always speak about how we raise our children up to be the leaders, the illuminators, the saviors of Israel. Are they born that way or are they made that way? I think saying they're born that way, even if it's true, even if that's the divine plan, right, is a relinquishing of the responsibility of thoughtful parenting, and that we do want to raise our children. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi. It could be an everyman story, to raise our children to have moral consciousness, to stand up to injustice, and to be an advocate, and in their own small way contributing to the larger whole, a redeemer of Israel. I'm going to end, and I'm already past my time. We say every day, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema beviat HaMashiach. I believe with full faith in the coming of the Mashiach, and even though the Mashiach tarries, I will awake every day for his arrival. The Rambam famously says that Israel will be redeemed when they do tshuva, and not a moment before. When they do tshuva, they'll be redeemed. So how could we say, I believe every day in the coming of the Mashiach, and at the same time affirm the Rambam's idea that redemption only comes when people do tshuva, when the Jewish people does tshuva? So Rabbi Soloveitchik reconciled these divergent sources and said, you have to believe every day that Israel is capable of doing tshuva. One of the founders of our shul, the late great Professor Marvin Fox, Rabbi Marvin Fox, would like to tell people, either bring Mashiach or be Mashiach. And he said it with a twinkle in his eye. And what he meant was, right, we each have our part to birth and to bring the redemption. That is something perhaps we're destined for, but is certainly something that we have to be developed for, develop ourselves in, and ultimately find the courage to stand up and make it be. Okay, my dear friends, I am over time. I'm going to stop sharing, but I am happy, with Jay's permission, to stay on, even though people are invited to sign off. And whoever wants to stay on, I'm happy to take questions, hear your observations and comments. And otherwise, I wish you all a good Shabbos, and I'll see you next year in Torah Moshe.
Maybe earlier. Maybe
earlier.
Okay. Yes. Vakasha, Annie, I see you got your hand up. Go ahead. Thank you.
I wanted to say, back at the time when we were talking about Moses with his mother, from what I learned in child psych, if I remember that far back, a baby whose needs are met consistently, such as with a nursing mother, a bottle-fed mother, doesn't matter, father, but the baby develops a sense of compassion because the baby thrives on his needs being met. And I think we see Moses' sense of compassion in the later years when he sees the Egyptian beating the slave, which must have happened all the time to other people, but nobody had that trait of compassion for the Hebrews because they were their slaves. They were no more than a slave. So that was the point I wanted to make about his first 2 or 3 years with his infant needs being met. But I had one more thing.
Yeah, but let me just comment on that, and then I'll hear your second thing.
Okay.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, indeed, part of attachment theory that it is necessary for moral development and compassion development. And one of the studies, if I recall correctly, is in the end of the 20th century, just 30, 40 years ago, they had studied these mass orphanages in Central Europe, like Romania.
Yes. Romania.
And these were like hundreds of children in cribs with not enough staff to do anything but, at best, change diapers and feed the children, but not hold them, cuddle them, laugh with them, cry with them. And they grew up psychopathological. They did not have compassion. And that led to theorizing that those attachment years of someone nurturing a person is so crucial to the development of compassion and empathy and moral consciousness. So, yeah, that's an
Yes, I read about those studies as well when I was starting to become a grandparent many years ago.
And what's your second point, Annie?
The second point is what you said about how he was made in the palace. I agree with you with that. And it brought to mind something I used to tell my children and then my grandchildren when they switched from elementary to high school. And I said to them, you were lucky enough to be born with this environment, with these capacities, your intelligence, you're this, you're that, whatever. But now you're going to high school. And don't think you can just feed on that. You've got to put in much more effort. You know, if you're good at something as a young child, it's fine. I said, that was given to you from Hashem. I said, but now you have to put in your part. And in high school, it's a different, I told all my children that, and half my grandchildren. I think now I've forgotten, but the other half, I better tell them. But that's what you said. He was made, and it's a different part of childhood development. And I thank you because I never looked at I've done Shemot a few times, and I've never looked at it with these eyes that you're looking at it, that you made us look at it.
Thank you. I'm honored by that, and I wish you a happy birthday. I see the happy birthday sign in your background.
Well, my husband, we keep it up because he he can stand on a chair and go up high, but I can't. So we just leave it up. We just leave it up half the year until we eventually take it down for the next birthday.
Okay, Sandra and Chaim, and then we'll call it a good night. And
I enjoyed
Okay,
what
thank you. And just to build on what Annie said, first of all, thank you. So you asked the pointed question and you liked sticking to the Pshat. So if the Pshat for the first 20 years, we've only seen Moses or the lad or the yelad or the infant in a passive sense. But the minute he vayetze, when he stands up and he comes out, we see a spate of verbs. And you read them to us.
Yes.
Yakam vayetze, vayar, vayar, vayar. We see getting up, going out.
Yeah, he's a man of action,
seeing,
100%.
He becomes that person that Annie's talking about in high school or post-high school. He was up until then absorbing, and now click. And I think the text really, really is shining a spotlight on
100%.
those verbs.
Rashi notes the duplication of the word vayigdal, the verb, in two subsequent psukim. So Rashi says, echad lekoma ve'echad legdula. The first is talking about a physical maturation, and the second is talking about a psychological, a spiritual, a moral maturation, right? He arises into his own and he becomes, in your wonderful representation, a man of action, filled with very active verbs, one after another, boom, 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 boom.
Yes, and the Vayar actually continues to thread, not just when he sees the injustice and his brethren, but when he sees it in Midian, he sees the Vayar verb continues and he sees the Sneh, Bo'er, Einenu Ukal. I mean, so the Vayar verb, Vayakam, Vayigdal, Vayetze, and Vayar, Vayar, Vayar,
So
Vayar.
you have to add to your pre-verbal, post-verbal, pre-conscious, post-conscious, pre-visionary, post-visionary.
Whoa, I like that. Anyway, thank you. This was marvelous. Thank you very much.
Chaim.
Right now she said, Vayar, Vayakom, started with Vayelech Ish Mebet Levi. It really started from that Ish Mebet Levi that had the emunah and had the bitachon to move.
Beautiful.
Later on, Moshe Rabbeinu grew in a home, the bitachon was there. So what the mother does, 3 months passed, and the time she can do, and she put him in the suf. She trusted Hashem. She trusted so far, so long, and that trust Moshe was built in. ותתצב אחותו מרחוק, Miriam trusted also, but she wanted really to see that everything is okay. The mother put, so it's all a family affair involved in bringing up Moshe. In those 3 years, in those 3 years, whatever, 2, 3, we don't know what it is, that's the basic foundation that you get to the child. 100%. And when he met Hashem in the bush, he also believed. Imagine yourself, you go to such a vision. It doesn't matter how old you are, 20, 40, whatever. When you see such a vision, and it is his curiosity, וירא את הסנה, ולא הוקל. Not everybody will go to see it. So he had what really needed. And I believe he got a very good basic bitachon b'Hashem. And he grew up in a very good education. He got the top education because he grew up in the house of Paro. Put the two together and you get a leader.
I love that. We credit appropriately the women of the beginning of the book of Exodus who birthed the redemption, women who choose to have children in the face of persecution, the midwives, the daughter of Pharaoh, the mother, the sister of Moses. And you say, add to the list, the father of Moses, Vayelech Ish Mibeit Levi, he also had emunah. there's emunah that is seeded in the household, and that is the seeds that sprout and flourish later on that help make Moshe who he is destined to become. I think that's beautiful.
I'd like to tell you
Thank you.
about a word play that I'm having in a poem which I'm publishing next week in the Jewish Journal. I say Hamayaldot are the Egyptian citizens, and the Ha'ivriot describes Ivritzins.
Wow. Gershon, last time we studied together, you were kind enough to send me your poem and your essay. Maybe I could ask you to send it to me again?
Would you give me your email address again?
I'm going to put it in the chat, and everyone's welcome to capture it if they want to ever reach out to me for any reason. I put it in.
I get many of
Sorry,
Gershon's
I
poems.
wrote the wrong one. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Jay, you get the last word.
Yeah, no, that's worth. Thank you very much. Okay, no, I
email?
just sent out. You should have just gotten our schedule for all their quote unquote winter programming. Just went out, I think, a few minutes ago.
Could you send me the email address again of Rabbi Samuels?
I'm sorry.
He said he was going to send the email.
Yeah, he put it in chat box. And of course, Gershon, if you send it to me, I can always forward it, like you often do. Send me your poems that he writes all the time. And
I'll do it to you after this talk. All right?
okay, and I can forward it, but it's there. It's in the chat box. The
Shabbat
thank you,
Shalom,
Benji.
everyone.
Thank you, Benji. Okay, everybody, have a
Thank
Laila
you.
Tov. My class, of course, tomorrow in the Siddur, 9:25 in the morning. Sunday morning, Rabbi Leiptag kicks off the week, and we're looking forward to learning with you. And thank you, Benji. Look forward to being in touch, and all the best. Yasher Koach. Very nice. Thank you. Laila Tov, everybody.
Thank
תודה
you.
רבה, לילה טוב.
Good job.